And here we are again, and this is going to be our last recording for the 1920s material. I apologize if you hear some scratching and banging and rustling in the background. One of my kittens has gotten into a box with some packing paper in it, and I'm sure will soon be going absolutely nuts. Because, yeah, that's cats for you. So what we've done up to this point with the 1920s has really been centered around the overarching theme of the kinds of tensions that have existed in American life. Things that we definitely see in the 1920s, and then in some respects, things that we can see in very, very similar parallels in the country today. We talked in the first recording about politics, the period of Republican dominance in the 1920s, what was going on in terms of scandals during the Harding administration, the laissez-faire approach that we will return to when we talk about the Great Depression in the next sessions, the political sort of realignments that are hiding under Hoover's win in 1928. Then we talked about some of the social tensions, whether it was urban versus rural, modern versus tradition, young versus old, gender, right, that kind of thing. This session, we're going to talk about the kind of social movements that are reactions to some of these things, the new woman, the new Negro, as they're known. We'll talk about some of the cultural output of the 1920s. It's a very, very vibrant decade in terms of American culture. And then also talk about the kind of leisure situation, because modern technology, changes in population sort of locations in the country mean that you have some really dramatic changes in media culture, in popular culture, in leisure culture, that kind of thing. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started with the new woman. So women get the right to vote in 1920. They are one of the very last major population groups in the country to finally break that barrier. And I mentioned in the progressive era stuff that this is in some ways a kind of a schizophrenic movement when the suffrage movement is progressing in the 19th and early 20th centuries. There's not a lot of agreement, even among the leadership of the movement, about whether women should be pursuing broader social equality or whether gaining the right to vote will be the first step towards that kind of process happening more naturally. There are some women in the suffrage movement that say, you know, we don't even want those kinds of expanded opportunities and broader areas of equality. So it's really left to individual people in the 1920s, in some respects, to define for themselves how they see this process sort of progressing. So lots of women do see the right to vote as an opportunity to expand their role in other areas of society, whether that's in access to education, whether that's in jobs, whether that's in claiming more legal protections for themselves and legal rights for themselves, whether that's even all the way down to the more intimate levels of relationships and sexual relationships and that kind of thing, right? So some of what's happening is going to be kind of derailed or disrupted by the fact that suffrage was the focus for so long, and in some cases at the exclusion of the consideration of some of these other issues that were very prominent. But some of it really does see an opportunity for women in particular to kind of stretch the boundaries of what was accepted socially. And so women start to sort of dress differently, right? They start to break away from the more restrictive, I don't want to say Victorian, because that's the word that is typically used not entirely accurately in all of this, but the more repressive, more restrictive kinds of moral code, fashion code, social code that defined women's lives prior to the 1920s. And over time, this is going to be a process that will contribute to the emergence of a more active feminism movement by especially the 1960s and into the 1970s. But it is unfortunate because some of that gets distracted in the 19-teens and 1920s because of the decision by certain leaders in the women's movement, people like Susan B. Anthony, for instance, to focus on suffrage as the end-all, be-all of the movement. So women are beginning to expand their horizons in the 1920s. It's a slow process. In some respects, it happens more at the personal level than it does sort of at the broader social or economic level. Those kinds of changes are going to be unleashed more with World War II in the 1950s and then into the 1960s. But it is a significant part of how American society is sort of adjusting during the time period. In a similar vein, African Americans also begin to sort of claim more social, legal, economic, political equality. This is a decade when blacks are moving in large numbers to different parts of the country. And you have a couple of very significant leaders of sort of black culture and black society at the time, W.E.B. Du Bois, who is one of the very first African-American students at Harvard. He graduates with his PhD. If I remember right, he's the first African-American Harvard PhD graduate in history. And he's the first PhD graduate from Harvard. It happens to be a doctorate in history. He's one of the founding members of the NAACP. And Du Bois undergoes a fairly dramatic kind of transition in his view on race relations throughout his life. Initially, he advocates a position that says that African Americans should be pushing for not assimilation, but inclusion, right? The difference being assimilation is sort of allowing your culture to be absorbed into another culture. And Du Bois says, look, the black experience is a dynamic and worthwhile one that has a lot to say about the American condition at large, and the inclusion of black voices and black participation in society and in politics and in the economy and in intellectual culture will only help the country as a whole. But he also says that racism and race relations will continue to be a significant feature in American life, probably for the next century or so, which obviously he's not wrong. And Du Bois has a very cautiously optimistic idea about what he expects things to be like. He will become much more cynical, especially through the 1950s and into the 1960s, as he sees some of the violence and some of the reactionary behavior of people during that time period who resist the civil rights movement. And he begins to sort of change his mind about the likelihood of black Americans actually finding that kind of equality and that kind of inclusion in the country. Sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum is an immigrant. He's from Jamaica. His name's Marcus Garvey. Garvey has a very different perspective about race relations. Garvey is an early advocate of what one could call Pan-Africanism, basically the idea that people from the African diaspora, that basically means people from Africa who had traveled or been forced from Africa into other parts of the world, especially the New World, especially the United States, the Caribbean, Central America, South America, should reject assimilation, should reject trying to find their place in the societies in which they live, but rather he emphasizes a more radical form of race pride. He organizes what's called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, designed to emphasize that particular approach to race relations. And he forms a company, the Black Star Steamship Company, to try to accomplish what he refers to as the Back to Africa movement. Basically, what he wants is for people of African descent in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere, to have an opportunity to return back to Africa. He feels that Africa is the homeland of Africans or people of African descent living in the Caribbean, in America, in South America, etc., and that the only way that they can fully realize their cultural potential, their economic potential, their political freedoms and political potentials is to return to Africa or to go to Africa. It's in some ways kind of a misguided idea because, for one thing, at this point, most of Africa is under European control, and so no matter where you would go, if you were traveling in Africa, even if you were black, you wouldn't really have access to the mechanisms of power anyhow, and your opportunities would be as restricted or maybe even more restricted than they would be living in, the Americas. But his ideas are very much a precursor of some of the ideas of people like Malcolm X. Malcolm X's father, in fact, was a Garvey supporter, a Garvey follower. And so it is definitely a significant alternative that is being presented to some of the ideas of people like Du Bois. And it will definitely reappear as a fairly powerful kind of concept that in some ways sort of needs the 1960s in order to help it bear fruit, right? And so it's not a coincidence that groups like the Black Panthers and broader kinds of Black Power efforts, Pan-Africanism efforts, really come into the forefront in the 1960s. But Garvey is laying a lot of those foundations in many respects. That's Du Bois on the left, Garvey on the right. Part of Garvey's difficulty was he was a very flamboyant guy, and in some respects, he kind of played into existing racial stereotypes at the time, because he tended, when he made public appearances in parades or speeches or that kind of thing, he tended to dress in these really over-the-top, false military outfits, right? Here he's kind of dressed as a naval officer, like a 19th century British naval officer, and that didn't necessarily help him in gaining the recognition or the respect of white audiences. It was already going to be difficult for him to begin with, but by playing into some of these kinds of stereotypes of flamboyant or exaggerated behaviors that whites had about blacks at the time, that didn't help his case either. But lots of really interesting ideas, and definitely somebody that is significant intellectually beyond what he often gets credit for. So the 1920s also sees a flowering of American literary culture and kind of culture in general. And we can see that in two movements. One of them is the Harlem Renaissance. The other is what's collectively known as the Lost Generation. So the Harlem Renaissance is an attempt primarily centered in the Harlem neighborhood of New York City, New York City, to expand the involvement of African Americans in the cultural output of the country, right? So black contributions to American culture go, you know, as back as far as there have been blacks in the country. But for the most part, those contributions have either been largely ignored or kind of misrepresented, or in some cases sort of co-opted by mainstream white culture and then claimed for their own, right? So in the 1920s and 1930s, there were concerted efforts by a number of African American artists, writers, social thinkers, intellectuals, musicians, to say, you know, look, these kinds of cultural outputs are ours, and this is us talking about our own experience. Part of this is set off by that great migration that I've mentioned before, right? Millions of people moving from southern states into northern, midwestern, and eastern cities, places like New York, places like Chicago, places like Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, right? Part of this is in an effort to find jobs and economic opportunities. Part of this is in an effort to find political freedoms, legal protections, that kind of thing that they weren't getting in southern states. And so Harlem then, which had already been a center point for sort of black settlement in New York City, really becomes this vibrant spot for a lot of different music, a lot of different literary productions, whether it's poetry or drama or novels, or sort of social theory. People like Alan Locke become really significant in terms of presenting sort of social commentary on the decade. And so it becomes an attempt to put African Americans into the intellectual universe to match what they see as gradually improving conditions economically, socially, legally, politically, that kind of thing. Now, that's certainly not to say that they have sort of crossed this imaginary barrier and they are welcomed with open arms into sort of broader white society, but there is evidence in northern cities especially of a certain amount of improvement. That has to be taken, though, with a very large dose of caution, because I don't want to suggest that it is this kind of utopia where people have all of the things that they've been hoping for and that they've been limited to in southern states, because it's not that at all. My guess is that between the output of the Harlem Renaissance and the output of the Lost Generation, most of us are way more familiar with the output of the Lost Generation, which is unfortunate. But the reality is that I suspect that most people will have read something by F. Scott Fitzgerald and or Ernest Hemingway, possibly somebody like T.S. Eliot, who are all sort of wrapped into this broader description of the Lost Generation, whereas fewer people probably have been exposed to the writings of people like Langston Hughes, Paul Laurence Dunbar, people like that. The Lost Generation, primarily writers, not so much people in music or visual arts or that kind of thing like we see with the Harlem Renaissance. But the Lost Generation, lots of people who are frustrated from what they see as American sort of provincialism, right? Parochialism, people who, from their perspective in America, just don't have an interest in the outside world, who are either intentionally or not sort of limiting their horizons to the things that they're familiar with, right? Kind of mass-produced culture that's just churned out and is chewed up by the American public without any kind of real meaning or real depth. And so a lot of these people, either permanently or for large parts of their lives, end up leaving the United States because they say, you know, this is a stifling intellectual culture for us. We are not going to be appreciated. We are not going to be able to get our message out there to a receptive audience because Americans just aren't interested in seeing what we have to say or understanding what we have to say. And as I said, some of these are still some of the heavy hitters in American arts and letters. People like Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, T.S. Eliot, right? Really, really significant figures who have a large impact on the way that, for one thing, Americans view the 1920s, but also end up being very significant figures in a lot of American lit classes. And as I said, you know, sometimes to the unfortunate exclusion of people from other traditions that don't always get the same kind of treatment or same kind of coverage. So in addition to the literary culture and the intellectual culture of the time, this is also a period of dramatically expanding consumer culture, mass media, that have very profound and long-term consequences for the country too, right? This is a period when the media machine is really steaming ahead, sort of full bore, right? You have the introduction of radio in the 1920s, which adds a completely new dimension for the movement of ideas, the movement of advertising. The kind of consumer culture of the 1920s is very, very similar to what we would expect to see throughout the rest of the century and all the way down to the present. Print media, like magazines, are getting more and more savvy about the ways to convince consumers to buy things that they otherwise had never needed or never sort of felt would be essential to their lives. So you have millions of radio sets being sold during the decade. You have millions of automobiles being sold during the decade. Tens of millions of automobiles being sold during the decade. You have widespread consumerism in household appliances, in home ownership, in travel and tourism, right? Lots and lots of different things where people are spending their money. And it's partially due to this dramatic upsurge in mass advertising at the time. By the same token, Hollywood is sort of perfecting its craft in the 1920s. So you start to see, by the end of the decade, the introduction of sound into movies. You start to see films that are being presented and developed specifically for movie theaters instead of the old form of kind of Nickelodeons and movie houses and things like that. In sports, the existence of the radio means that increasingly sports figures are going to be national celebrities, right? Not just kind of local heroes or even regional kinds of figures. So prior to the 1920s, if you lived in, you know, Pittsburgh, if you lived in Cleveland, if you lived in St. Louis, you knew about your team. You knew about the results when your team played some other team, and we're talking primarily baseball here, right? Because professional football doesn't get started until the 1920s, and even then it's not very widespread. That's not really going to happen until the 1960s and 70s. And so it's a very narrow kind of perspective of sports. With the invention of the radio and with the ability for the radio to deliver sporting events across the country, potentially, it means that you have figures from the sporting world, just like in other kinds of industries like motion pictures or politics, figures that start to become celebrities, right? Start to become iconic figures in different disciplines that could not have done that before, right? And so, for instance, Babe Ruth, right? Babe Ruth starts as a pitcher in Boston, he certainly is a significant figure in the Red Sox while he's pitching for them. He gets them into a couple World Series, wins a couple World Series. But it's not until he moves to New York City, and he moves there right at the cusp of the introduction of the radio. And that is really one of the things that turns him into a national superstar, right? Because radio stations around the country are going to be able to broadcast Yankees games and introduce Ruth to people around the country that otherwise would not really be exposed to any of his antics on the ball field. By the same token, boxing is hugely popular before the 1920s, but it's also a local kind of a thing. With the 1920s and with radio, boxers like Jack Dempsey then become celebrities in their own right, because people from all over the country can hear bouts that Dempsey fights in. For instance, in the mid-1920s, Dempsey fights in a boxing match in Montana, and more than 100,000 people attend the actual fight itself in Montana. But if you think of it, there's no reason why a fight would take place in a city like, or a state like Montana, unless there was some way to guarantee that people around the country would be able to experience that same fight. And the way that they can do that is through radio, right? So it gets broadcast around the country. Millions of people listen to the fight on the radios. So changes that will sort of presage or point towards changes that we will see then in the 1940s and 50s, when television starts to become much more of a significant player in the national media sort of affair. But also things that, when we get into the Great Depression in our next topic, definitely we're going to be pointing back to some of the rampant consumerism that's going on in the 1920s, because one definitely has something to do with the other. So that's the end of the 1920s material. Let me know if you've got questions about any of that. Our next topic then is going to be the Great Depression. It's a really, really interesting kind of moment in American history, and the Depression and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal plan that he kind of sets in motion beginning in the 1930s, really going to have profound impacts on American life and American politics going forward. So, excuse me, that's going to be our next topic. I hope everybody's doing really well. Let me know if you've got questions, and I will see you all soon.